Long before our homes hummed with central heating and soft electric warmth, the world was a colder place. Winters were not gentle then. They were long, slow seasons that wrapped around the land like a grey cloak. And in that stillness, in castles of stone and cottages of wood, people learned to live not by banishing the cold, but by understanding it. Imagine the year is 1350. The fields lie empty beneath frost, the rivers stiff and silent. You stand before a medieval castle, tall, grand, but unwelcoming in the dawn. Its towers rise into a sky, the color of pewter. The stones glisten faintly with ice, and if you step closer, you will notice something strange. For all its strength, the castle breathes cold from every corner. Inside, the great hall is vast and echoing. The walls, built thick to withstand siege, also trap the chill within. A single fire burns in the center of the hall, a low, steady flame upon a bed of glowing coals. Its smoke curls upward, disappearing through a hole in the high timbered roof. This is warmth in the medieval world. Small, flickering, precious. You can hear the faint crackle of logs, the occasional sigh of wind that finds its way through the gaps in the stones. Around the hearth sit a few figures cloaked in wool, their hands outstretched toward the fire. Even so, the warmth never travels far. Beyond the circle of light, the air is icy again. The castle may protect them from the weather, but it does not comfort them. For those who lived within such walls, warmth was not a guarantee. It was a skill, a daily act of survival. The wealthy had servants who rose before dawn to stir the embers back to life. The servants themselves often slept close to the kitchens, where the heat of ovens offered a brief, smoky relief. In the noble chambers, heavy tapestries hung against the walls, not just for beauty, but to soften the relentless cold seeping through stone. Rugs were rare and precious, woven thick to trap warmth underfoot. And yet, even lords and ladies would wake to frost on their bedposts. They slept under furs, wolf, fox, or bear, and sometimes even wore layers of linen and wool to bed. A single candle flame would shiver beside them, flickering in the draft that always crept through keyholes and cracks. But let's step outside the castle now. Walk down the hill, past the outer walls, past the fields gone stiff with frost. There, in the valley below, lies a small village. Cottages huddled close like sleeping animals. Thatched roofs sag gently under a coat of snow. Here, too, people have found their own ways to keep warm. Inside one of these cottages, the air is thick with the scent of peat smoke. The hearth glows orange in the corner, the heart of the home. It never truly goes out. Even in sleep, the family tends it carefully, banking the embers on the ash to preserve their heat until morning. When dawn breaks, a child will stir them with a stick, breathing life into the ashes until the first spark returns. The walls of this home are made of wattle and daub thin by modern standards, yet layered with straw and clay to hold in what little heat they can. The single window is covered not with glass, but with oiled parchment, soft and translucent, keeping out the wind but letting in a dim gray light. The family sleeps close together. Parents, children, perhaps even the old grandmother, all in one room. The warmth of bodies shared through the night is their truest comfort, and if you listen closely, you can hear it. The slow rhythm of breathing, the faint hiss of fire, the creak of wood as it expands and settles. Blankets are few, but they are layered thick wool, woven by hand, patched over the years. Sometimes they cover themselves with cloaks or even sacks stuffed with straw, and above them, hanging from the rafters, are bundles of herbs, thyme, rosemary, mint, drying in the heat that drifts upward. Their fragrance fills the room, masking the scent of smoke and animals. For yes, even the animals share the warmth. Cows, goats, and chickens often sleep under the same roof, separated only by a wooden partition. Their breath and bodies add warmth to the air, a living furnace of sorts. It may sound crude now, but in those days, it was clever practical and deeply human. Step outside again. The world is utterly silent. The air bites at your skin, yet from every chimney rises a thin curl of smoke, each one a small defiance against the winter. Warmth, in those times, was not constant. It was fleeting, precious, and earned through effort, but perhaps that made it all the more meaningful. Evening returns, and the light fades from the fields. In the castle, the fire burns low again. In the cottages, families gather by the hearth, telling old stories as they mend clothes or stir the pot of stew. The cold presses against the walls, but inside, the glow holds firm. And if you listen, you can almost hear it. the whisper of firelight against stone, the gentle sigh of those who have learned to live with the cold, and the ancient heartbeat of a world that found warmth not in luxury, but in togetherness. When we think of medieval warmth, the image that comes to mind is always the same: a fire glowing in the hearth. But the story of that hearth, and how it came to be, is one of quiet evil. For in the earliest centuries of the Middle Ages, there were no chimneys, no tidy fireplaces framed with carved stone. There was only fire and smoke. Picture again that great castle hall from before. In its center, a wide open hearth burns directly upon the floor, the flames licking upward through the gloom. Above it, there is only a hole in the roof, called a louver, to let the smoke escape. But the wind is rarely kind, and so the smoke curls and drifts, filling the rafters, settling in the tapestries, stinging the eyes of anyone who dares sit too close. Servants learned to live half-blind in that fog of heat and haze. The walls darkened over the years, turning from pale stone to soot. Yet this was life, warmth and smoke. Discomfort and survival mingled together. As time passed, masons began to tame the fire. They learned to build hearths of raised stone, enclosed on 3 sides, to draw the smoke upward instead of outward. And then, sometime around the 12th century, a new invention crept quietly into Europe: the chimney. It was a marvel of its age, a vertical shaft of stone that carried smoke up and away, pulling fresh air in to feed the fire below. Chimneys changed everything. They allowed heat to spread more evenly, and for the first time, separate rooms could each have their own fireplace. Castles no longer had to rely on one smoky hall. Now, lords and ladies could have smaller, private chambers, each warmed by its own fire, a symbol of comfort and status. But the idea was slow to spread. In small cottages, a proper chimney was a luxury few could afford. Many homes kept their fires in the middle of the floor, just as they always had, with the smoke escaping through a gap in the roof or through the thatch itself. Imagine the scent that lingered there, the thick perfume of wood smoke clinging to every garment, every wall, every strand of hair. The cottage itself seemed to breathe smoke, season after season. Still, even in simplicity, the hearth was everything. It was the kitchen, the heater, the light in darkness, the gathering place of the family. Children learned early to tend the flames, how to stir the embers just so, how to feed the fire without smothering it. Mothers brewed and baked over it, using iron pots suspended from hooks or tripods. Fathers dried their boots beside it after long days in the fields. And at night, when all work was done, they would draw close, telling tales while sparks rose and vanished like stars. In the manor houses and abbeys of the wealthy, fires grew grander still. Masons carved fine mantles of limestone and marble, sometimes decorated with coats of arms or scenes from scripture. The fireplace became not only functional, but ceremonial, a stage upon which warmth and power were displayed together. Servants, however, knew the truth. Fires were greedy things. They devoured wood by the cartload. A single large household could consume entire forests over the course of a winter. In England and France alike, laws were passed to regulate the cutting of timber, and villages began to feel the weight of scarcity. To stretch what little wood they had, people learned to burn peat cut from the bogs and dried in the sun. It burned slower than wood, giving off a deep, earthy smell that filled the room. Others turned to charcoal, made in hidden pits in the forest, the product of careful smoldering rather than open flame. And so, warmth became not only a comfort, but an economy. Whole trades grew around it: woodcutters, charcoal burners, and chimney sweeps, all part of the quiet machinery that kept the fires of medieval life alive. In monasteries, the hearth held a special place. Monks lived under vows of austerity, yet they too could not ignore the cold. They built great warming rooms, calefactoria, where the brothers could thaw their hands after long hours in the unheated cloisters. The fire there was both a necessity and a mercy, a small reminder that warmth could coexist with devotion. If you walk through an old abbey today, you might still find traces of those hearths, blackened stone, the faint scent of soot preserved in the pores of ancient walls. Each one is a memory of a world that understood how fragile warmth could be, and there was something almost spiritual in the way people tended their fires. To let a hearth go cold was an act of carelessness, even of disrespect. Fire was life itself, unpredictable, beautiful, dangerous, and necessary. In some households, the first flame of the year was lit with ceremony, often using embers borrowed from a neighbor's hearth. It was a quiet ritual of connection, a reminder that no home truly stood alone. And when spring returned, and the days grew longer, the fire was allowed to rest, still there, waiting, as if asleep beneath its ashes. The house would smell of wood and time, and for a moment the people of the medieval world would remember what it was to live, not in comfort but in rhythm, with seasons, with fire, with the turning of the earth itself. The fire was more than heat. It was the heart of human civilization. But warmth was never just about flame. It was about what surrounded it. In the next chapter, Ella step away from the hearth and into the lives of those who depended on it most. The people who gathered fuel, tended the flames, and fought the endless chill of winter day by day. In the medieval world, warmth did not come free. Every flicker of flame in a lordess hearth or a peasantess cottage came from hands that worked, bent and blistered to keep it alive. Picture the dawn, pale, breath turning to mist. The fields are stiff with frost. In the distance, a thin column of smoke rises, where someone has already begun their day's labor. That someone is usually not the noble who enjoys the fire's comfort. It is the servant, the peasant, the gatherer, the quiet backbone of warmth. For these people, keeping warm was not just about comfort. It was about survival. The wood gatherers in the forests, woodcutters began before sunrise. Their axes rang out like solemn bells. They worked in small teams, men with calloused hands and thick woolen tunics, breath steaming in the air. Each swing of the axe was a rhythm, a heartbeat against the silence of winter. They chose their trees carefully, oak for long-burning fires, birch for kindling, ash for steady heat. Some forests were owned by nobles or monasteries, and cutting there without permission was theft, a crime that could lead to fines, imprisonment, or worse. And yet, poor villagers often had no choice. At night, they would slip into the woods with baskets and small hatchets, gathering fallen branches, roots, or dry twigs. This act even had a name: Estevar rights in England, the ancient, fragile permission for peasants to take what the forest naturally shed. But when winters grew harsh, those rights were often ignored. The people gathered what they needed to live. The forest, in return, gave grudgingly slow. Damp logs that smoked more than they burned, moss-covered stumps that hissed in the fire like angry spirits. Children, too, took part in this quiet battle against cold. They roamed the woods in pairs, hands red with chill, searching for anything that might burn pinecoon's bark, even dried cow dung when wood ran short. Each small armful was precious, worth the warmth of a night's sleep. The servants of the flame back in the castle, warmth was managed with military precision. Before dawn, the fire servants, sometimes called hearth boys, or chambermaids of the coals, would wake long before their masters. They would creep through the sleeping corridors, carrying small baskets of embers, shielded from the draft. Their task was simple but sacred: to rekindle the fires before the household stirred. The halls were cold, the air sharp with the scent of ashes. They knelt before each hearth, blowing softly on the embers, coaxing them back to life. It was a skill that took years to perfect. Too little breath, and the ember died. Too much, and the ash scattered, choking the flame. By sunrise, the great hall would glow again, and the master's chamber would be warm enough for comfort. But by then, the servants' hands were already blackened and sore, their faces streaked with soot. Still, they worked silently. To keep fire alive was not glory, it was duty. Firewood had to be split, stacked, and dried, always kept close, but never too near the flame. Peat had to be fetched from the moors, heavy and crumbling, wrapped in sacks to dry. Charcoal had to be tended for days in hidden pits, where men lived in the forest, smoked until their hair smelled of nothing else. Women and the hearth. And yet, in every home, the true keeper of the flame was the woman of the house. She guarded the hearth like a hearth. Each morning, she knelt before the ashes to stir the coals, whispering small prayers as she worked. To her, the fire was not just heat, it was protection. It cooked the meals, dried the clothes, kept away the damp that could rot walls and bones alike. A forgotten fire was more than inconvenience. It was a sign of neglect. In many villages, the women would share embers from one home to another. If one hearth went cold, a glowing coal would be carried in a clay pot from a neighbor's fire. It was warmth passed hand to hand, a ritual of community older than memory. They used the flames to boil water for washing, to heat stones that could be wrapped and placed in the bed before sleep. And as the night fell, the fire became a quiet companion, its light flickering over faces tired from work. The sound of crackling would a lullaby against the silence outside. The struggle of the poor for the poorest. Warmth was always uncertain. In some winters, there was simply not enough fuel. They burned anything that would catch straw rope, even dried seaweed or scraps of cloth. Their cottages were built of wattle and doba, thin walls that shivered in the wind. To fight the cold, families slept close together, wrapped in shared blankets of rough wool. Livestock, goats, sheep, or pigs, were sometimes brought inside for the night, their bodies giving off precious heat. The scent of hay, smoke, and animals blended into one, a strange, leaping warmth. Children learned early to make games of gathering fuel, to turn necessity into play, and when the nights grew longest, they would listen to stories, tales of warmth that lived only in imagination. Dragons whose breath could melt snow, suns that never set, saints who could light fires with their prayers. In this way, warmth was not just physical, it was emotional, communal, and spiritual. Even the poorest could find comfort in the glow of a story told beside a dying flame. A world of smoke and effort. So much of medieval life was lived in smoke, thick, constant, and familiar. It stung the eyes and darkened the ceilings. But it was also the smell of life itself. When you stepped into a medieval home, no matter how grand or humble, the scent of wood smoke told you something important. Here, there are people who endure. Here, the fire still lives. The people of that world did not take warmth for granted, because they had to earn every degree of it. Each log split, each ember carried, was a small act of faith against the cold. And in that faith, in the endless tending of flame after flame, humanity learned something profound. That warmth is not given. It is created, shared, and protected. In the next chapter, we'll move deeper into how clothing, materials, and clever ingenuity helped people survive winters when even fire wasn't tea enough from fur-lined cloaks to heated stones, and the quiet wisdom of layering and insulation in a world before science had names for such things. In the medieval world, warmth was not only built, it was woven. Before the first log was set upon the hearth, before the day's work began, people wrapped themselves in layers of fabric that were as vital as any fire. The right clothing meant the difference between endurance and illness, between life and frostbite. To understand how people kept warm in those long, bitter months, we must enter their wardrobes, not the ornate, perfumed closets of nobles, but the humble wooden chests and hooks that held the lives of common folk. The rule of wool was the king of fabrics. Every class, from lord to shepherd, relied on it. The reason was simple. Wool lived, it was warm, even when wet, breathable, yet insulating, and could be woven into countless forms. Coarse for peasants, soft and fine for nobility, its fibers strapped tiny pockets of air, turning each garment into a cocoon against the chill. From the lowest tunic to the grandest cloak, wool was everywhere. It came from the countless flocks that dotted Europe, from the sheep of England, Estamp Hills, to the hardy breeds of Spain and the Alps. Women spun it in their cottages, their fingers working almost automatically as they talked or watched the children. Men sheared it, washed it, and sometimes dyed it with earth pigments, muted browns, mossy greens, smoky grays. For the poor, garments were few and precious. A peasant might have only one outer tunic, patched and repatched, worn in every season. In winter they simply laid more beneath it, linen shifts, wool hose, perhaps a rough cloak if they were lucky. Each layer was a shield. When night fell, those same garments doubled as bedding. Cloaks were draped across straw mattresses. Tunics hung near the hearth to dry before the next cold dawn. For the rich, however, wool was refined into beauty. Flanders and Florence produced fine weaves, soft as air, dyed in jewel tones. Nobles lined their garments with fur, trimmed them with embroidery and gold thread. But beneath all the splendor, the purpose remained the same: to keep warm. The blessing of fur. If wool was warmth's foundation, fur was its crown. The Middle Ages adored fur, not just for luxury, but for survival. Sable, ermine, fox, rabbit, and squirrel. Each had its place in the great hierarchy of comfort. The finest, like ermine or sable, were reserved for the nobility. The white fur of ermine became a symbol of purity and power, often used in coronation robes and royal mantles. Common folk, of course, could never dream of such finery. Instead, they used what the land offered: rabbit, cat, lamb, or even sheepskin turned inside out. The fur-lined cloaks were heavy but vital. The warmth they gave could mean the difference between shivering through the night or sleeping peacefully beside a low fire. In northern regions, furs were worn inside garments, with the fur facing inward to trap body heat. Hoods were lined with rabbit or fox. Gloves were made from lambskin, soft and pliable. Boots, too, were stuffed with straw or fur scraps. Anything that could hold a warmth close. Fur was not just comfort, it was status, economy, and even politics. The fur trade was a medieval powerhouse. Merchants traveled across Europe with bundles of pelts. The Hanseatic League thrived on it, and the cold northern forests of Russia and Scandinavia became treasure troves of warmth. To touch fur was to touch wealth, but to wear it even humbly was to defy the cold's cruelty. Layer by layer, the genius of medieval dress lay in layering. People knew instinctively what modern science would later prove, that several thin layers insulate better than one thick one. A peasant might wear a linen undershirt soft against the skin, a woolen tunic for insulation, hose tight at the waist with cords, a cloak, or a surcoat on top. Nobles added more padded doublets, fur-lined robes, and hoods that could be drawn tight in a storm. Even armor, that symbol of medieval might, was built on warmth. Beneath metal, knights wore quilted gambesons, thick, padded jackets that absorbed sweat and blocked the chill of steel. The poorest laid whatever they owned: rags, scraps, and old sacks. Children were wrapped in pieces of old cloaks or blankets, often bound with string to keep them from falling off. The air between each layer became a hidden ally, keeping the body's heat from slipping away. Head-to-toe warmth began at the head and ended at the feet. Everyone knew that a bare head or cold toes could freeze the rest of the body. Woolen caps, sometimes called coifs, were worn indoors and out. Even under helmets or veils, they were rarely removed in winter. Men might wear hoods called chaperons, long and pointed, with folds that could be wrapped around the neck like a scarf. Women's veils, too, were often layered linen beneath, wool above. Footwear was a battle of endurance. Leather shoes, even for the rich, offered little insulation. Peasants stuffed straw or moss inside to soak up dampness. In harsh winters, some wrapped cloth around their feet before slipping on their boots. A simple but effective trick still used in some cold lands today. The scent of warmth clothing carried the scent of smoke. Because fires burned day and night, every garment was touched by its breath, a faint reminder of the hearth's presence. In castles, this mingled with perfumes and herbs. In cottages, with the raw scent of earth and work. Washing was rare in winter, so garments aged with their owners, growing softer, thinner, more familiar. A wool cloak could last a lifetime. It might begin as a father's, pass to a son, and end as a blanket for a child. Clothing, like warmth itself, was communal, shared, mended, repurposed. Each stitch carried a memory of survival. Even amid hardship, people sought beauty. They embroidered edges with colored thread, wove patterns into the wool, and tied bright cords around their waists. A splash of red or green against the snow was a small defiance, proof that warmth was not only of the body, but also of the spirit. When the long nights fell, families gathered by the hearth to mend their clothes, patching holes, spinning new thread. The sound of the spinning wheel, the crackle of the fire, the murmur of old stories. These were the real warmth of medieval life. And when at last the garments were hung to dry beside the hearth, shadows dancing across them, the people would sit quietly, wrapped in layers not just of wool and fur, but of history itself. In the next part, we'll move from fabric to architecture, exploring how the very walls and roofs of medieval castles and cottages were shaped to capture, preserve, and protect warmth. In the medieval world, even the buildings themselves seemed alive. Each stone beam and thatch laid down with a purpose older than the masons who shaped them. To survive the cold was not just a matter of what people wore, but where they lived and how they shaped the spaces around them. Warmth was built into the very bones of their homes. The great castles of Europe stood proud on hilltops, but they were not the cozy fairy tales we imagine. Their thick stone walls, meant for defense, held the cold more than they kept it out. In winter, those walls could sweat with frost. The people inside learned to live in layers, not just of clothing, but of space. They built warmth into smaller corners. The main halls, so grand in daylight, were cavernous and cold once the fires burned low. The heat from the hearth rose to the high ceilings, while the floor stayed chilled, so people drew closer together, setting benches and tables near the fire's glow, closing off drafts with heavy tapestries. The fabric hung on walls was not mere decoration, it was insulation. A thick woven tapestry could cut the cold wind that slipped through cracks in the stone. In cottages, warmth began from the ground up. The homes of peasants were small, sometimes built half into the earth, their floors of packed clay covered with straw to soften and insulate. The low ceilings trapped heat, and smoke from the hearth filled the air until it found its way out through small vents or thatched gaps. That smoke, though choking at times, carried a strange mercy. It sealed the thatch from insects, darkened the beams, and made the air thick enough to hold warmth a little longer. The hearth was the heart. Every home, no matter how humble or grand, revolved around it. People slept near it, cooked upon it, and prayed beside it. The embers were kept alive through the night, often buried beneath ash, to preserve the coals until morning. There was a quiet reverence in tending the fire, a ritual of care that kept families alive. In larger castles, fireplaces grew elaborate. Stone chimneys rose like veins through the walls, carrying warmth upward to chambers above. The very idea of a chimney was once a marvel of engineering, a way to tame smoke and reclaim heat. Before chimneys became common, smoke would fill the hall and drift out through a hole in the roof. But once the idea took root, warmth could be directed and controlled. It was a small revolution in comfort. In peasant homes, though, the hearth remained open, primal, and communal. One fire, shared by all. Sometimes the animals were brought in at night, their breath and bodies lending their own heat to the room. The family slept together, children pressed close to parents, wrapped in wool and rough blankets. The animals shifted inside, the fire crackled softly, and the wind outside howled against the thatch. Inside that circle of warmth, life was simple and deeply human. In monasteries and manors, the approach to warmth took on more design. Monks, who rose before dawn to pray in cold stone chapels, developed clever ways to preserve heat. Some monasteries built underfloor heating systems, using flues that carried warm air from the kitchen or the bakehouse beneath the floors. The Romans had done it before them, and though much of that ancient knowledge had faded, fragments remained, carried by memory and necessity. Even without such marvels, the placement of rooms spoke of wisdom. Kitchens were often built on the south side to catch the sun. Bedchambers faced away from the wind. In towns, houses leaned together so their shared walls kept out drafts. In cities like London or Paris, the narrow streets and overhanging upper floors weren't just a matter of space. They trapped warmth, holding the day's heat through the night. People also used their windows, or rather, their lack of them. Glass was rare and precious. Most homes had only shutters or thin linen stretched across wooden frames. When the cold bit hard, these were closed tight, sometimes covered with animal skins or stuffed with straw. The darkness that filled the room brought silence, stillness, and the faint comfort of heat not escaping into the night. Every sound in a winter home was slow and intimate. The shifting of logs, the creak of wood as it expanded in the fire's warmth, the quiet breathing of sleepers under layered blankets. Outside, the world was frozen, but inside, the walls, though simple, gathered warmth like memory gathers love imperfectly, yet enough. Castles used design tricks too. Thick walls stored heat from the great fires, releasing it slowly through the night. Small inner chambers, called solar rooms, were built high in towers where sunlight could reach. Lords and ladies often slept there instead of in the grand halls, preferring the quiet and the warmth. The floors were sometimes covered in rushes dried plants, mixed with herbs, both to soften steps and to insulate against the stonish chill. In peasant cottages, the same principle appeared in miniature. Families sometimes built sleeping platforms above the hearth or near the roof, where rising heat gathered. The higher one slept, the warmer it was. The loft might be small, but it was a haven, a pocket of warmth in a world of frost. The smell of burning wood was everywhere. It clung to hair and clothing, became part of the fabric of life. Each fire had its own scent: oak, birch, pine, and the smoke told stories of the land itself. Even now, when one catches a whiff of wood smoke on a cold evening, some part of the old memory stirs, the part that once huddled close to firelight and found safety in its glow. Warmth was never taken for granted. Every ember was precious. When a family moved, they sometimes carried coals from their old hearth to light the new one, a quiet blessing of continuity. To keep the fire alive was to keep the heart alive, and each home, however poor or grand, guarded its warmth like a soul. And so, medieval people did not just live in houses, they lived with them. Their walls spoke, their fires breathed, their floors remembered footsteps. In the deep of winter, when the wind moaned against the eaves and frost patterned the glassless windows, people gathered close and found that warmth was not only made of fire or stone, it was made of presence, of togetherness, of endurance. The cold could not conquer them, because they built their lives around the small, steadfast glow of warmth. In the medieval world, warmth was not only found in firelight or in thick walls, it lived in food. Each meal was an act of survival, a ritual of comfort that joined the body and the spirit. People understood, perhaps more deeply than we do now, that what one ate could hold back the cold, and that the simple act of sharing a meal could bring a warmth no fire could match. The day often began before sunrise. The hearth, buried the night before in a bed of ash, would still hide a faint red glow. Someone, usually the woman of the house, would stir the coals gently, coaxing them back to life. The smell of smoke would fill the room, followed by the crackle of new wood catching flame. Then came the first warmth of the day, porridge. Porridge was a constant companion through the centuries, made from oats, barley, or millet, whatever the land could give. It was simple, thick, and sustaining. It could be boiled in water or milk, flavored with salt or herbs, or, if fortune smiled, sweetened with honey. The heat of it was as important as the taste. In the chill of dawn, that first spoonful, steaming and earthy, brought life back into numb fingers. In cottages, cooking was done over open fires, often in a large iron pot suspended by a hook or chain. The pot rarely left the fire. It simmered all day, receiving whatever ingredients were at hand. A bit of meat, if there was any roots from the garden, wild greens from the forest edge. This was the medieval pottage, a stew that could be stretched endlessly as new things were added and old things simmered away. The warmth that rose from the pot filled the small room, carrying the scent of life continuing. It was a quiet comfort, a steady reminder that as long as something bubbled on the fire, the home was alive. Even when food was scarce, people found ways to make warmth from it. Bread baked on stones, chestnuts roasted in coals, or onions wrapped in clay and baked in the embers. Every method was old, passed down by memory rather than recipe. In castles, the kitchens were grander, but just as vital. Down in the lower halls, far from the sleeping chambers, cooks worked in great, smoky rooms, lined with stone hearths. Fire roared day and night, roasting meats and heating water. The air shimmered with heat, the walls blackened with soot. Yet even the cooks worked close together, their movements practiced and rhythm. The warmth in the castle began here, not in the great hall, but in the kitchen below. Food, in any form, was a gathering point. When meals were served in the hall, people came not just to eat, but to be near one another. The high tables of lords and the long benches of peasants both echoed with the same sounds: the clink of bowls, the murmur of voices, the sigh of fire. In winter, the meals seemed to last longer, as if people lingered near the warmth to delay the cold waiting beyond the walls. In those times, there was a certain poetry in how food was shared. A piece of bread passed between hands, a pot tilted to pour broth into another's bowl. These gestures carried more warmth than the meal itself. Hospitality was sacred. To offer warmth, be it a place by the fire or a bowl of hot stew, was to affirm one as humanity. In a world where cold could kill, kindness was a shield. And in monasteries, warmth and simplicity blended. The monks ate in silence, but the silence was gentle, filled with the sound of wooden spoons and the whisper of robes. Their food was plain but warm. Lentil soup, barley bread, stewed apples. It was warmth of another kind, the warmth of discipline and shared peace. When they prayed before eating, they gave thanks not just for the food, but for the fire that had softened it. People also believed in foods that held heat within them, warming foods, as they were called. According to the humoral theory of the time, foods carried qualities of hot or cold, dry or moist. Mutton was warming, fish was cooling. Spices like pepper, ginger, and cinnamon, rare and precious, were prized for their warmth. A single pinch could turn an ordinary meal into a kind of medicine against winter. The spice trade, in fact, was driven as much by the longing for warmth as by taste. Across oceans and deserts, men risked everything for sacks of pepper or nutmeg, small seeds of distant sun. When they reached Europe, those spices were treasured, mixed into wines and stews, and used to warm the body from within. To sip spiced wine by the fire was to taste the memory of faraway summer. For most, though, warmth came not from exotic flavors but from closeness. Families huddled around the hearth for the evening meal. Children ate from their parents' bowls, the same spoon dipped and shared again and again. Afterward, the pot was cleaned, the ashes spread, and people sat quietly in the flickering glow. Someone might mend clothing, another might tell a story, but always the fire remained steady, breathing, alive. Even in the hottest winters, there were small joys. The smell of baking bread, the hiss of fat dripping into flame, the sound of boiling stew. These things wrapped around the heart like a blanket. The world outside might be white and still, but inside there was movement, warmth rising, voices murmuring, the steady beat of life continuing. When people went to bed, they carried that inner warmth with them. It lingered in their hands, in their breath. Sometimes they placed heated stones, wrapped in cloth, near their feet. Sometimes they slept with a covered pot of coals beneath the bed. Risky, but necessary. The fire never left their thoughts. It was their oldest companion, their silent guardian through the long night. And when morning came, when frost glimmered on the beams and the air was sharp with cold, someone would rise, uncover the hearth, and find the faint red glow waiting. The same fire, the same life, ready to begin again. In the world before central heating, warmth was something you carried with you. Every layer of clothing, every woven thread, was a kind of defense, not just against the cold, but against the long silence of winter itself. People dressed not for fashion, as we think of it today, but for survival. Yet, in that necessity, they found a quiet beauty. The most common fabric, for rich and poor alike, was wool. It was the miracle material of the Middle Ages. Warm even when wet, soft when well spun, and strong enough to last through years of hard use. Sheep were more than animals. They were guardians of warmth. Their wool became cloaks, tunics, blankets, and sometimes even the roofs over people's heads, as felted wool was used to line thatch and patch gaps. From the highlands of Scotland to the plains of France, spinning wheels turned day and night. Before spinning wheels, women used drop spindles, small weights that twirled and twisted wool into thread. The sound of spinning was as constant as breathing in a medieval home. By the fire, mothers and daughters worked together, fingers stained with lanolin and soot, twisting, pulling, and winding. The rhythm of it was hypnotic, like a quiet chant. Once the thread was ready, it was woven into cloth. Looms stood in corners of cottages and castles alike. Each piece of cloth was precious, the result of days, even weeks of effort. In winter, the fabric grew heavier, denser, the weave tighter. The color might be plain gray or brown for peasants, or rich, crimson, and blue for the wealthy, dyed with costly pigments. But the warmth was the same, held in the wool itself, not the color. In small villages, families often shared clothing between generations. A good wool cloak could last decades. It might begin as a father's outer coat, become the son's winter wrap, then end its life as patches on a quilt. The people of that age had a deep respect for fabric. It was time, labor, and care made visible. Fur, too, played its part. For the rich, fur was a symbol of status. Kings wore ermine and sable. Queens were wrapped in soft miniver and fox. Even a single strip of fur around the collar spoke of wealth. The warmth was undeniable, but so was the message, I can afford comfort. In contrast, common folk used what was available: rabbit, sheepskin, or the pelts of wild animals trapped in nearby woods. Hunting in winter was not only for food, but for furs. Trappers set snares for hares and foxes, skinned them carefully, and hung the pelts to dry. The smell of tanning filled the air, a mix of smoke, fat, and earth. When the fur was ready, it was sewn into cloaks or caps, lined with rough linen, stitched by hand under candlelight. Every piece was practical, but also deeply personal. There were many ways to layer warmth. A simple peasant might wear a linen shirt beneath a wool tunic, then a cloak fastened with a wooden pin. In the coldest months, they added hose for the legs, mittens or fingerless gloves, and perhaps a coif, a small cloth cap that tied under the chin. Wealthier folk added padded garments beneath their outer layers, creating a kind of early insulation. Blankets were rare luxuries. Most people slept in the same clothing they wore during the day, wrapping themselves in cloaks or animal skins. Bed linens, when they existed, were made of coarse linen or hemp. Yet people knew how to trap heat. They slept close, families together, children between parents. The old near the fire, the combined warmth of bodies was their greatest comfort. Textiles also carried memory. A mother's cloak might still smell faintly of the herbs she gathered. A husband's hood might carry the scent of smoke from the field fires. Clothes were mended and patched, each stitch telling a small story of endurance. To throw away a garment was almost unthinkable. It was repaired until it could be repaired no more. An event in its fabric would be reborn, as lining, rag, or quilt. In monasteries, the wool habits of monks were thick and simple, often undyed, the natural gray of the sheep. The cloth scratched at the skin, a reminder of humility. Yet even in this austerity, there was warmth, not indulgent warmth, but one of endurance. When a monk pulled his cowl over his head in the chill of early prayer, he felt the quiet embrace of something both physical and spiritual. Travelers, too, had their ways. They wrapped themselves in great cloaks called mantles, often lined with fur. Some even carried small stones, heated in the fire, and tucked them into cloth pouches beneath their cloaks. Others wore boots lined with straw, which trapped air and insulated their feet. Every journey in winter was a test of preparation and of patience. In castles, servants were responsible for keeping garments clean and dry. Clothes were hung near fires, brushed, and occasionally scented with herbs to mask the musty smell of damp wool. Lavender, rosemary, and thyme were popular, their fragrances faint but comforting. Sometimes, nobles even warmed their clothes before dressing, holding them close to the hearth or draping them over heated stones. The difference between rich and poor was not only in the type of fabric, but in the layers of it. A lord might wear 5 or 6 garments at once. A peasant, perhaps only 2, but both felt the same sharp wind and the same relief when warmth returned. The shared human experience of cold erased the distance between them, if only for a moment. And so, in every hut and every hall, the rhythm of spinning, weaving, sewing, and wearing went on, the quiet industry of survival. Clothes were not fashion. They were protection, memory, and love, stitched together with patience. Every layer was a story, and every thread held warmth that came not just from wool, but from human hands. In the Middle Ages, the architecture of warmth was born not from luxury, but from necessity. Every stone, every timber, every layer of earth-packed floor had a purpose to keep the biting cold at bay. Unlike today's homes, where heat hums invisibly through pipes and vents, medieval warmth had to be made, tended, and protected like a fragile flame. Castles were the giants of the landscape, strong, proud, and cold, built for defense, not comfort. Their thick stone walls could hold back an army, but they also held in the chill. In winter, those walls became icy sponges, soaking up frost and returning it to the air inside. The people who lived there, even kings, felt that cold in their bones. But still, they found ways to fight it. The heart of every castle was its great hall, and the heart of the great hall was its fire. Enormous hearts, sometimes wide enough for a man to stand inside, blazed with oak and ash. The fire never truly went out. When the flames died, the coals were banked under ash to glow through the night, ready to be woken again at dawn. The air above the fire shimmered and danced, but beyond that small circle of heat, the cold returned, lurking in corners, clinging to tapestries, creeping across the floor. So they hung heavy drapes on the walls, not only for beauty, but for insulation. Velva, wool, or even simple linen soaked in oil became barriers against drafts. In some rooms, the cloth was painted or embroidered, so that even warmth had its decoration. Windows were another challenge. Glass was rare and costly, found only in the wealthiest homes, or most people had shutters. Instead, thick wooden panels that could be closed tight at night. In the day, they opened to let in pale light. At night, they shut out wind and snow. Some covered their window openings with oiled parchment or horn, letting in a soft, diffused glow while keeping the air out. Floors were lined with rushes or straw, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or mint. These rushes were not merely decoration. They were insulation. They softened the sound of footsteps, absorbed moisture, and offered a bit of warmth to bare feet. Once a saison, they were swept away and replaced, though in practice, many homes let them linger far longer, until they became part of the floor itself. In the cottages of the poor, the struggle was even greater. Walls were made of wattle and daub, a framework of sticks plastered with mud, straw, and dung. The mixture, once dried, was surprisingly sturdy and helped keep out drafts. The roof was thatch, thick and sloping, sometimes 2 feet deep. In winter, it became a home for birds and mice, but it also trapped heat like a woolen blanket for the house below. There was usually one main room, the hearth in the center, smoke curling up through a hole in the roof. The smoke didn't leave quickly. It lingered, weaving through the air, darkening the rafters, but it also helped preserve the wood and drive away insects. In its way, that smoky haze was part of the warmth, harsh on the eyes, but gentle on the bones. The hearth was more than a place for fire. It was the soul of the home. Around it, people cooked, mended, told stories, and prayed. The fire gave light, safety, and comfort. At night, its last embers were covered with ash to sleep until morning, like a living creature resting. In monasteries, Warmth was an act of discipline. The great stone churches were cold by design, places of humility where breath turned to mist in the morning prayers. But the monks had their warming room, a small chamber with a single fire, where they could thaw their hands before returning to work. For some, that brief moment of heat was a spiritual reminder that comfort, like salvation, must be earned through patience. Even the wealthy struggled with the cold. In a noblewoman's chamber, fires burned in wall hearths, and braziers filled with glowing coals were carried from room to room. Servants placed heated stones or iron pans beneath their master's bed before nightfall. The beds themselves were fortresses of warmth, heavy wooden frames draped in curtains, layered with fur blankets and feather mattresses. When the curtains closed, the small space within became a cocoon of heat, breathing faintly with the rhythm of the sleeper. In smaller homes, beds were simpler, straw mattresses stuffed into linen sacks, laid directly on wooden frames or the floor. The straw was replaced when it grew flat or damp, which might mean once a year, sometimes less. Families often shared the same bed, not out of affection alone, but for survival. Body heat was a gift. To share, it was an act of quiet love. Clever builders learned tricks to trap warmth. Some cottages were built half sunk into the earth, their floors below ground level where the temperature stayed steady. Others faced south to catch the weak winter sun, with small windows to hold it in. The walls, thick and rough, absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. And in cities, where houses stood shoulder to shoulder, warmth was shared unknowingly. The heat from one hearth bled through to the next, so that an entire row of dwellings seemed to breathe together one long exhale of survival. When snow fell, blanketed the world in silence. The smoke from 100 chimneys rose into the still air, slow and blue. Inside those homes, people gathered close, the fire painting gold on their faces, the sound of crackling wood, the hiss of sap, the quiet murmur of voices. These were the lullabies of the medieval winter. They lived with the cold, not against it. They learned its moods, its patterns, its gifts. The cold made them cherish the hearth, the cloak, the cup of warm broth. It taught them patience, thrift, and gratitude, lessons that echoed through centuries. In the medieval world, warmth was not only found in flames and furs, but also in what people ate and drank. Food was a form of comfort, a defense against the cold that crept through every crack and shadow. The taste of warmth, the spice on the tongue, the steam rising from a bowl, could feel as precious as gold. When winter came, the rhythm of life slowed. Fields lay silent under snow, animals huddled in barns, and people turned inward, relying on what they had stored. The cold shaped their diet, not through luxury, but through endurance. What they ate was what they could preserve. Salted meats hung from beams. Wheels of cheese rested in cool cellars. Barrels of ale and cider waited in the dark. Root vegetables, buried in sand or straw, slept like seeds until needed. In the castles and manors, the kitchens were worlds unto themselves, loud, smoky, full of heat and motion. Fires roared under blackened cauldrons, spits turned slowly, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. These kitchens were usually built apart from the main hall to prevent fires and keep smoke away, but the heat they produced was a kind of hidden blessing. Servants worked with flushed faces, their arms bare in the glow, while outside, frost covered the windows like lace. The cooks of the wealthy had a secret understanding that food could warm the spirit as well as the body. They used spices, not just for flavor, but for their hot nature, according to medieval medicine. The great scholars of the time believed that everything in the world was made of four humors: heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. A person's health depended on keeping these in balance. In winter, the body was threatened by cold and damp, so warm and dry foods were thought to heal. So they filled their dishes with cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, pepper, and cloves. These spices came from faraway lands, from Arabia, India, and beyond, carried on ships and caravans across oceans and deserts. To sprinkle such treasure into a stew was to summon warmth from the other side of the world. Even the drinks were crafted to chase away the chill. There was hypocras, a spiced wine sweetened with honey, often served warm at feasts. There was posset, a mixture of hot milk, ale, and eggs, thick and rich, like a blanket in a cup. On long winter nights, a mug of warm ale laced with ginger or herbs could make even a peasant's hut feel like a king's hall. Bread, too, held warmth, not just from the oven that baked it, but from the effort it took to make. In cottages, women rose before dawn to knead dough by hand, their fingers stiff from the cold. The smell of baking bread filled the small home, wrapping the family in a kind of quiet joy. Fresh bread, even coarse and dark, was a sign of life, continuing proof that the fire still burned, the hunger still met. The hearth was the kitchen's soul. Above it hung cauldrons and pots. Around it lay stones blackened from years of use. There were no stoves, no chimneys in the earliest cottages. Smoke drifted freely through the air, finding its way out through a thatched roof. The people didn't mind. The smoke meant heat, and the heat meant survival. Meals were shared close to the fire, for the farther one sat, the colder the food became. Families ate from wooden bowls, their spoons worn smooth with use. The rich trenches thick slices of stale bread that served as both plate and sponge. When the meal was done, the trencher was eaten or given to the poor. Stews were the heart of the poor man's kitchen, thick with barley, beans, onions, and whatever bits of meat could be spared. They simmered all day, slowly absorbing the flavor of the hearth. A pot might hang there for weeks, with new ingredients added as others were eaten. In that way, the stew was almost alive, growing and changing like a member of the household. And then there was ale. Not the strong drink we know today, but a mild, yeasty brew that everyone drank, even children. Water could be unsafe, so ale was a daily comfort, a gentle warmth that carried through the cold months. Brewing day was a small festival in itself. The smell of malt filled the village, and neighbors helped one another lift the barrels and stir the mash. The noble feasts were something else entirely. Grand performances of warmth and power, whole animals roasted on spits, their fat hissing into the fire. Minstrels played, goblets clinked, and guests laughed through clouds of steam and smoke. Between courses, servants carried in dishes of hot broth or spicy sauces to rekindle appetite and heat. Candles flickered in iron sconces, their flames reflected in silver and gold. Yet, even there, the cold found its way in. The great halls were vast, and the fire's warmth faded quickly. Guests kept on their cloaks and gloves, and sometimes even their hoods. They lifted their goblets with stiff fingers, grateful for every swallow of heat. Food, in those times, was not just nourishment, it was resilience. Every bite was a victory against the winter's hunger. Every warm bowl, every shared loaf, was a promise that life would continue through the frost. And in monasteries, where silence ruled, meals were taken with reverence. The monks sat in long, stone-walled halls, their bowls filled with thick soup and bread. They ate in silence, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the echo of their own breaths. That quiet, humble warmth was its own kind of peace. At night, when all was done, the kitchens cooled, the embers glowed faintly, and the last bit of warmth drifted upward into the sleeping rooms above. Families huddled close, their bellies full, their hearts at ease. Outside, the wind sang against the shutters. Inside, the world was still, and somewhere in that stillness, the faint hiss of the fire, the scent of ash and bread. People found comfort enough to dream. By now, the fire in the hall has softened to a slow heartbeat of light. The great logs that once cracked and spat with sparks are now half a shahaf coal, glowing deep red like the inside of an embered dream. The night in the medieval world was long, far longer than ours, and the darkness outside felt alive. But the people inside, they were not alone. You see, warmth in those old times was never just a matter of fire or furs. It was also a matter of bodies, voices, breath, and belonging. Humans, through all the centuries, found heat in each other. The hearth, the glowing center of every home, was more than stone and flame. It was the heart around which life circled. In the cottages of peasants, families would gather close after the day's labor. The smell of stew lingered in the rafters. The children lay together on straw beds, wrapped in wool or linen. Sometimes, even the animals shared their space. A cow or goat nearby, a hen roosting quietly in the corner. Their warmth filled the air, and the rhythm of their slow breathing was the music of the night. It wasn't luxurious, but it was enough. The fire would fade, and the cold would creep, but there was comfort in company. People shared warmth without even thinking, a shoulder touching, hands clasped in prayer before sleep, the small joy of knowing someone else was near. In castles, the nobles had grander beds, heavy drapes, and feather-filled mattresses. Yet even there, warmth was social. Servants slept in chambers just outside the lord's room. Guards kept watch by the gatehouse fire. The castle breathed as one great organism, its corridors alive with the pulse of people and flame. In winter, no one truly slept alone. That idea of solitude belonged to poets and hermits, not two peasants and knights. The world was too cold for isolation. Even the smallest act, a shared blanket, a mug of warm ale, a story whispered before sleep, was an act of survival. In many parts of Europe, there was even a word for this closeness. Haig in the Old Norse regions, cozy in English tongues that were still forming. It meant not just comfort, but shared warmth. The warmth of being safe together when the wind howled at the door. And the wind did howl. It slipped through cracks in the stone, moaned in the rafters, and made the shutters rattle like restless bones. But inside, someone would stir the embers. A little orange glow would bloom again, pushing the darkness back. Someone else would sigh in their sleep. A dog might thump its tail once, reassured by the faint light, and slowly, everyone would drift into dreams, the kind that come when you are tired, content, and safe for the night. People didn't have clocks, but they had rhythms, the long nights that stretched from one fire to the next, the steady turn of seasons. Winter was for gathering close, for storytelling, for remembering, and in those moments, warmth became something almost sacred. Not just a physical sensation, but a connection between people, between generations, between the living and those remembered in quiet prayers by the fire. Some chroniclers wrote that in the deep cold months, even the breath of others seemed precious. The air in a cottage would shimmer faintly with mist, each exhale visible in the flickering firelight. You could see warmth itself rising, pulsing, vanishing into the rafters. It was fragile, beautiful, and fleeting, like life itself. In monasteries, monks also shared warmth, though differently. They woke in the cold hours before dawn to pray, and the only heat came from candles and their own bodies, kneeling side by side. Their breath filled the chapel, mingling with the scent of wax and stone. The silence was deep, but not empty. It was filled with a small warmth of faith and endurance. And out in the fields, shepherds kept their watch, wrapped in thick cloaks, huddled beside small fires. They too understood the ancient truth. Warmth is never wasted when shared. Even the smallest spark, passed from torch to torch, or from one heart to another, was enough to keep the night away. In this way, warmth in the Middle Ages was a language. One without words, a shared fire, a shared blanket, a shared story, each act a quiet promise that no one would freeze alone in the dark. Perhaps that is why we still gather around light. The glow of a screen, a candle, a fireplace. Some ancient part of us remembers. The night may be softer now, the walls tighter, the air controlled by modern magic, but that deep human comfort, the one that comes from closeness, it's still the same. So as the castle sleeps and the cottages hum with slow breaths, the world grows still again. Outside, frost blooms on the window glass, tracing pale flowers in the moonlight. Inside, someone stirs, half awake, feeling the faint warmth of another beside them. A sigh, a murmur, then stillness again. The last log falls into ash, but the warmth remains. The night, in those faraway centuries, was not merely darkness. It was an entire world of its own. After sunset, the world slowed, then transformed. The air outside grew heavy and blue, and fires inside glowed brighter, their light turning the rough stone walls into honey-colored warmth. But keeping that light alive, that little island of safety, was a task that never truly ended. For in a time before electricity, before radiators or even reliable candles, the night could be an enemy. Fire was both a guardian and a threat. It kept away the cold, yes, but it also demanded attention. It needed feeding, watching, tending. If it went out, the darkness could swallow everything. If it burned too high, a thatched roof might catch, and the warmth of a home could become its destruction. And so, in many places, castles, monasteries, and simple cottages, there was always someone who stayed half awake through the night watch. In a peasant's hut, it was often the eldest or the lightest sleeper, perhaps a mother nursing her child, or a father who stirred easily at the sound of the wind. They would rise once or twice through the long hours, poke the fire with an iron rod, add a little wood or dried peat. The faint glow would bloom again, pushing back the edges of the dark. The children, wrapped in their straw-stuff bedding, might stir, then drift back into slumber, soothed by that simple rhythm, the sound of fire being fed. In castles, this nightly duty was more structured. Servants or guards were appointed to watch the great halls, especially during the bitterest months. They walked softly through echoing corridors, lantern in hand, checking every brazier and hearth. the sound of their boots on cold stone, the creak of a torch bracket, the whisper of smoke. These were the sounds of safety. Down in the kitchens, even the embers had their own caretaker. Large manor fires were banked carefully, a mound of ash piled over glowing coals, trapping the heat beneath. By morning, the cook could scrape back the gray dust and find, miraculously, a living ember still there, waiting to breathe again. It was a small ritual of resurrection, repeated every dawn. In monasteries, the duty was sacred. Monks kept vigil not only over their faith but over the flame. Some orders treated fire as a symbol of divine presence. It must never die out completely. One monk, wrapped in his coarse wool habit, might walk through the dark cloister, hearing only the faint sound of his sandals and the distant hoot of an owl. He would pause before the altar lamp, trimming its wick or replacing its oil. In the stillness, he might whisper a short prayer, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, something must stay alight. And outside, the world slept differently. The forests whispered with wind and small creatures. The fields froze under thin silver frost. Wolves sometimes called from distant hills, though even they moved carefully in the bitter cold. The night, for all its quiet beauty, was not gentle. It tested everything. That is why warmth, and the keeping of it, became almost a kind of art. Each household, from hut to castle, had its own way. In the north, peat fires glowed low and steady, their smoke thick, but their heat lasting through the long nights. In the south, olive oil lamps flickered beside clay hearths. In the east, coals were carried in metal braziers from room to room, so that the warmth could travel with the people. There was a tenderness to it, this constant guarding of the flame, a quiet devotion, the same kind that a parent feels watching over a sleeping child, or a sailor feels tending the lantern that guides him through fog. Even the word hearth comes from old tongues, meaning heart. The fire was not at the edge of the home, it was its center. To keep it alive was to keep life itself alive. So imagine it now, the middle of a winter night in a medieval village. The stars are sharp above a white field. Every house is dark, but for a faint red glimmer through a crack in the door. Inside, a figure sits up, half dreaming, and stirs the coals. A spark leaps, small and golden. They watch it for a moment, smile, and settle back under the blankets. The house breathes again, quiet, warm, safe. And if I had faithful and low, home softly through the hours before dawn. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the thatched rooftops, the long night of keeping warm was ending. Smoke drifted gently upward from chimneys, thin and blue against the morning mist. Inside, the last coals in the hearth glowed faintly beneath their ash, breathing out a final pulse of heat before sleep. The people who had watched over those fires, the mothers, the servants, the guards, the monks, could finally rest. Their task was quiet, invisible, but essential. They had kept the world alive through another winter night. For warmth, in the medieval world, was never just a matter of comfort. It was survival, the fragile line between life and death. Every ember carried the weight of that truth. To lose your fire was to lose your heart. That's why so much of daily life, so many customs and superstitions, revolved around protecting the flame. When travelers moved from one village to another, they sometimes carried a small pot of coals with them, hidden under layers of moss or cloth, to start the next hearth without delay. When a new household was founded, a young couple beginning their life together, someone from the bride's family might gift them fire from their own home, a living symbol of continuity. To light your hearth from another's was a gesture of trust, an inheritance of warmth. Even in death, the connection remained. There were places where, during funerals, a single coal from the deceased's hearth was buried with them, a way of saying that no life ended cold, that even in the earth there was a trace of home. Over the centuries, the ways of warming changed. Chimneys became taller, bricks replaced timber, and glass windows began to hold the wind back more faithfully. By the late medieval period, the grand halls that once roared with open fires began to shrink into smaller, cozier rooms, the beginnings of what we now think of as home life. People discovered that warmth could be shared differently, too. Wool and linen became finer, more layered. Feathers filled quilts, and earthenware bottles held heated water for the night. Curtains were hung not just at windows, but around beds, little tents of warmth and privacy within the vast chill of stone houses. And yet, even as the technology of warmth evolved, the rhythm remained ancient. Light the fire, feed it, guard it. Rest. Repeat. The work was constant. but it was also soothing, the same way waves comfort a sailor, or the ticking of a clock comforts the sleepless. For people of those centuries, the sound of a crackling fire was the voice of life itself. It marked time. It gave shape to the day. Children fell asleep to it, lovers whispered beside it, old men stared into it, seeing memories dance among the flames. Sometimes, on long winter evenings, stories were told around the fire, tales of saints and spirits, of kings and commoners, of warmth and light battling endless cold, and when the fire grew low, someone would always stir it back to life, unwilling to let it fade completely. In those moments, storytelling and survival were the same thing. Both kept the dark at bay. It's strange to think, isn't it, that for all our electric comfort today, the soft hum of a heater, the glow of a screen, there remains something ancient in the way we still crave warmth. We wrap ourselves in blankets, sit close to light, gather in rooms where heat and calm exist together. The instinct is unchanged. The fire has only moved outward, into different shapes. So as the final embers fade in that medieval hearth, picture the quiet that follows. The cottage is peaceful, its air still faintly scented with smoke and ash. Outside, frost melts on the thatch. A rooster crows, someone stirs, rising to begin the day, to light the fire again. To start once more the endless, gentle cycle of keeping warmth alive. And somewhere, far away in time, you can almost hear it. The soft hiss of a log catching flame, the sigh of stone releasing heat, the murmur of another day beginning in the cold. The warmth endures, not just in the fire, but in the memory of all those hands that once tended it. And as you drift now toward sleep, think of them, the keepers of the hearth, the guardians of the flame. Their work was quiet, unseen, but it burned still, softly, in every home, in every heart that seeks the peace of warmth against the long, dark night.